complex. Okay, good evening. Hope you're all well. Today we're learning Maseches Chullin Daf Kufyud Tes. We're starting 7 or 8 lines from the bottom of Kufyud Chesem and Beis at Amar Rav. We'll be ending, please God, a third of the way down on Kuf Chaf Amar Aleph, and then of course back together in Rosh Hashanah on Shabbos. This upcoming week I have some travel days and some other days that I won't be available. I will keep you posted as to what that information is. And then hopefully Rabbi Handler will be subbing. I already asked him to sub. He said yes, so I'll keep you posted on that information. But we are together on Shabbos. Says the Gemara 7-8 lines from the bottom of Kufyud Chesem Beis. What is the status of the stem of an apple? What is the status of the peel of an orange? Are they really part of the food? So this really is a machlokes amoraim. Amar Rav. Rav says, Ein yad lepachos mikazayis. When we talk about a yad, let's say, for example, a stem or potentially a bone sticking out of a meat, whatever the case may be, ein yad lepachos mikazayis. It has nothing unless it's at least a kazayis of size. The ein shomer, and when we talk about a peel or something that's really part and parcel, the hide of the animal, inedible, leather is not edible, that is lepachos mikapul. There it has to be at least the size of a pool, which is a bean of some kind. Again, what the actual shiur is not relevant for us. But that is the sheet of Rav, this distinction that a yad has a shiur of a kazayas, shomer has a din of a pool. Rav Yochanan Amar, yesh yad lepachos mikazayas, v'yesh shomer lepachos mikapul. I disagree. So it's not how it works. Rabbi Yochanan has a little bit of a different process, and he holds that we do have a yad that's less than the shiur of a kazayas, and we do have a shomer that's less than the size of a pool. Neisve, the Gemara asks a question. We'll soon see that this question is really on both of them. Let's say we have a case of shnei atzamos. We have two bones. On each of the bones, there is a half of a kazayas of meat, but they're all at one end. So imagine that we have a stick. We have a bone right here, and the meat is only on one side. Two bones that are the same. So on the right side, the bone is dry to the bone, no meat. On the left side, there's a half kazayas, two bones like that. So says the Gemara, how does that play out in regards to tumas ohel? We know, of course, that if you have a kazayas of basar, you can generate an isser of tumas ohel. So it says the Gemara as follows: Machlokes Tanaim. Shnei atzamos, we have two bones. Ve'aleim shnei chatzois. And at the left end, again, I'm embellishing a little bit, but on the left end of these two bones, there's a half of a zayis, half of a kazayis. Behichnis roshehen hashniim, should be hashniim labais. The ends of the bones that have no meat are put inside a house. Ve'abayis ma'ahil aleihem, and the house is functioning as an ohel over the part of the bone that has no meat, and the part of the bone that does have meat is outside the house. So habayis tamei. It's an interesting din. We assume that there is going to be this extension into the house. Let me just get the case super clear. We have let's say the bone is 2 feet long. The right end of the bone is inside my house. No meat on that part of the bone. The left part of the bone does have meat, but it's outside the house. But the bone bridges the threshold of the house. So do we say that's tumas ohel, yes or no? So says the Gemara, 2 lines from the bottom on Kufyud Chesem Beis, yes, habayis tamei. So what do we see? We see that there is yad of some kind that brings the basar into the house. However, Yehuda ben Nekusa Omer Mishum Rabbi Yaakov, Heich Shnei Atzamos Mitzar from the kazayas. These two bones don't each have a kazayas. Each one only has a half of a kazayas, and they're not mitzarif. And he leaves the brisa with a rhetorical question. Now, this brisa poses a question for both Rav and Rabbi Yochanan, and let's pick this apart on the top of Kufyud Tes Amud Aleph. V'Rav, Hi b'mai ukimla. How did Rav understand this brisa about tumas ohel? Did he understand it like a yad or like a shomer? Ibi yad, if he understood it like a bone, so then that's kasha on the resha, because Rav held where we started today that when it comes to a yad, you need at least a kazayas, but these bones were each less than a kazayas. So if you want to say the case of tumas ohel was talking about yad, that doesn't make sense. And ibis shomer, if you want to say that our case was talking about a shomer, that the bone was a shomer to the meat, well, that would be a problem, kasha seifa. Then how does it make sense that they are not mitzdarif, because we do taka have the right amount of meat. Shach, we don't understand Rav. So says the Gemara on Kuf Yud Tes Amud Aleph, 2 lines down, Yibaisema b'shomer, Yibaisema biyad. I could explain the case of Tumas Ohel both as a case of shomer and as a case of yad. Let's do both. Yibaisema yad biyad. I could say that perhaps it's talking about a case of yad. That's fine. And Vihu, Rav holds the Amar, it shouldn't be Ki Rebbe Yehuda, but it should be Ki Yehuda ben Nekusa. Because if you look at the language of the Bryce at the bottom, it doesn't say Rebbe Yehuda ben Nekusa, it just says Yehuda ben Nekusa. We also have that by Shmuel, we have that by Rav, we have that by Abaye, we have that by a lot of people that they were not considered Rav. Yehuda ben Nekusa doesn't get the title of Rebbe. I don't even know who he was. And it's a very uncommon name in Shas. Does anyone have familiarity if this name was ever used before? I don't know. So, anyways, the Gemara says that perhaps one explanation of Rab is that we're not talking about Shomer, we're talking about Yad, and he holds like Yehuda ben Nekusa, Sema b'shomer, and maybe our Brisa is talking like a Shomer, Yehuda Amar Ketanakama, and he actually holds like the Tanakama, who holds that it's going to be Tameh, and that's a fine answer for Rab. That works out just fine. Rav Yochanan, how would Rav Yochanan answer this? Because you'll recall that we started today with the sheet of Rav, and then Rav Yochanan said that Yesh Yad Lapachos Mikazais v'Yesh Shomer Lapachos Mikapul. How does Rav learn the Bryce of Tumas O? Does he learn it like a Shomer, or does he learn it like a Yad? So it says the Gemara, Rav Yochanan Amar Kula b'Yad, v'Huda Amar Ketanakama. So Rav Yochanan would say, I hold like the Tanakama, and it's all good, and I would say that it's Tameh. So all of that is the first push to try and clarify the shitas of Rav and Rav Yochanan, and we pressure tested them against this case of the Tumas Ohel, and all is fine and good. They all were able to answer up their questions. Then the Gemara brings a new case. Tashma, Rabbi Yehuda Omer Kulis. When we talk about the kulis, which is like the upper bone of the leg, probably the femur or the equivalent to it, you see now, here we don't really have a choice. We kind of have to say it's a shomer. Why? Because there's a lot of bone marrow. When there's a lot of bone marrow, then the bone, by definition, is a shomer or not a yad. We'll come back to this in a minute. It's not going to be the havamin of the Gemara, but let's get back inside. Tashma Rabbi Yehuda Omer, the kulis, the femur, or one of the upper leg bones, sheyesh aleha kizayis basar, if in fact it has a kizayis basar, not like our case at the bottom where it was half a zayis, it has a kizayis basar, goreres kula latuma. That makes the whole bone metame. So again, let's take a case scenario. Not like we said before, where the right side of the bone is empty, the left side has a half of a zayis. The right side is empty, the left side has a huge amount of meat. So there, every Rabbi Yehuda says there's no question what's going on over there. Then it's goreres tuma, and then if the empty side of the bone is in the house, pashut, that's going to be tumas ohel. Acherim omrim, others hold afilu ein aleha ela kipul. Even if there's a tiny amount of meat, forget about your kizayis. Even if it's a very small amount of meat, says acherim, which is actually the same as the equivalent of saying Rav Meir, then goreres kula latuma. Even so, even the amount of a pool which is so small, there the Gemara says that the whole thing would be tamei, and even if the empty side of the bone was inside the house, it would be tamei tumas ohel. Virav, how would Rav deal with this? How does Rav understand this? Ibiyad kasha seifa. According to Rav, if this case of the kulis was treated as a yad, the seifa doesn't make sense according to Rav, because according to Rav it needs to be a kazais, and the seifa was a pool. And according to him, that should be tahor in that case, because it's not the right shiur for it to be a yad. And the ibishomer, if in fact Rav holds it to shomer, then kasha resha, then according to Rav, we don't need a kazais. He would even allow for a pool if it was a shomer. Mimanav shach. This case should not be like Rav. So it says the Gemara, Ibaisem a yad, v'huda amar Rabbi Yehuda. We could say that perhaps this case is like a yad, but he holds like Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that it's goreres kula latuma because there's a kazayis. V'baisema b'shomer ke'acherem. And maybe Rab holds that our case is like a shomer, but he holds like acherem that it's a pool. So either way, we can come up with an answer for Rab. For Rav Yochanan, how would he answer? Rav Yochanan amar kula b'shomer v'huda amar ke'acherem. Rav Yochanan would say that he holds that the case of the kizayis of basar on the bone is a case of shomer, and he holds like the acherim that a pool is the right size. The Gemara says, wait 1 second. If you look back at the way Rav Yochanan framed his shita when we started, Rav Yochanan said over there that when it comes to a shomer, it's just he says that yesh shomer lepachos mikapul. So it says the Gemara, acherim hakapul ka amri. Acherim was not of the opinion that it's eno el kapul. So according to Acherim, says the Gemara hakapul ka'amri. So Shmuel does have a very specific shiur, right? If you're holding that it's kapul, it's exactly that. Says the Gemara. Really, Rav Yochanan not like that. I did the Tanakama shiur ka'amri in hunami shiur. Really, it's not that way. Really, the Tanakama had a shiur, and it's also true that the Acherim also had a shiur, but it really wasn't a specific shiur. They just were creating equivalence and symmetry in the Mishnah and the Brisa, but it's really not that way. Omar Rava says, I can actually prove to you that our Mishnah is a case of Shomer. Dekanami de b'Shomer askinan. You're correct to say that the case of Kulis that we learned is talking about a case of Shomer, that it's not a Yad. And we're about 2/3 of the way down on Kufya Tasmadala. Diktani Kulis, Shmamina. We know because the Kulis is a bone that has a lot of girth to it, and in that bone is, by definition, marrow, which means it cannot be a Yad. It's not a stem, but it's treated more like a Shomer, which is something more significant, Shmamina. Itmar, the Gemara says, speaking about this same topic of whether or not the shiur of Acherim was a fixed shiur. Rav Chanina Amar Zehu shiur. It is a fixed shiur. Rav Yochanan Amar Ein Zeh shiur. Ein Zeh shiur. V'aktani kipul. Rav Yochanan, you yourself said that it has to be like a pool, and the Brisa says that it has to be like a pool. Says the Gemara, no, same answer we saw before. I did the Tana. I did the Amar Tanakama shiura. That since the Tanakama had a shiur, and if you look back in the Mishnah at the top, he said it was a kizais. Ka'amre inhu onami shiur. The Chachamim also said a shiur. Acherim also said a shiur, but that shiur is a limited shiur. It's really a non-specific shiur, just as, again, to have symmetry in the Mishnah. Tashma, let's try again. Let's press again. Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah, mitaher bishel pool, umitame bishel kitnis, mipnei sherotze b'mash mishon. This is talking about a shell of a bean of some kind. And when it is mitaher b'shel pool, that's a larger bean. It's mitaher, meaning the shell, I'm like thinking about like a peanut, how it has that little sheath around it, or edamame, where it has that, it has like the beans, most of the bean around it. So if there is a pool that has this little sheath around it, it's actually called a sharvit in Hebrew. So that is mitaher. That's not really relevant, and that's not something that we're worried about. It's not a yad or a shomer. It's nothing. However, umitame b'shel kitnis, in a small bean, we do care. There is a use for it, which we'll discuss in a minute. This is very problematic for Rav, because Rav said that even if you want to say it's a shomer, but a pool is the minimum size, the sheath that goes around the pool is way less than a pool. So how can Rav say pool? Kasha and Rav. Says the Gemara, Kid Amar Rav Acha the Rava bekulcha umishum yad, hachanami bekulcha mishum yad. Rav Acha the Rava will see his actual source soon. That here we're talking about a stalk that holds many beans. We're not talking about just one bean with its one sharvet, with its one sheath, but we're talking about a stalk. A kulcha is a stalk, and it's holding many beans. I'm trying to envision, like, if I hold a vine that has 20 green beans on it, right? So then I may actually have the shiur, so it's not a kasha on Rav. Umay b'mashmishan, bitashmishan. What does it mean b'mashmishan? That there's a use for the stalk. It means bitashmishan. The Rishonim here explain that you're holding a stalk that holds a lot of different things. So says the Gemara, let's try again. Toshma, 4 lines from the bottom on Kufya Tesmadal. Tatana de Rabbi Shmuel. This is a Gemara Menachos and a Gemara that we saw a couple days ago. Al kol zera zerua asher yizareya, on anything that's planted. Kederch bnei adam motziin, any seeds that are taken out to be planted. So then chita b'klipasa. That means we're going to have a seed that is a wheat kernel that has the sheath around it, useora bikli pasa, and barley that has the sheath around the barley, the pearl of barley, ve'adashin, which is a plural word, bikli pasa. And so here says the Gemara, what do we have going on? That even though all of these are less than the size of a pool, we still see that there's a potential for tuma. Kasha and Rav. Rav said that pool's the minimum shiur. With all these cases, the sheath that's around the sharvit is much less than a pool. Says the Gemara, beria shiny. Distinction. Even Rav would agree. It's not a kasha and Rav. Rav would agree that if there were to be a beria, so then we are good to go because a beria does have that din. A beria would have a din that it would be mitame. But any case where it isn't a beria, a partial pool or it's a torn pool, as we'll soon see in a little bit, then we would have a minimum shiur of a pool, but not with a beria. Good. That brings us to the bottom line of Kufyat Tesmud Aleph and says the Gemara as follows. Boy Rav Shaya, turning to the top of Kufyat Tesmud Beis. Rav Shaya asks the question, what if we have Shnei Shomrim? Mahu Sheitzarfu. What if I have two Shomrim together? Are they mitzaref to the shiur of a pool? At least according to Rav Yochanan. At least according to Rav. Says the Gemara, depends on the case. Hechidami. If you're talking about two shomrim that are layered on one another, so let's say there's two sheaths that surround a nut or a bean. So it says the Gemara, Umi'ika shomer al gav shomer. We for sure don't have a case of shomer al gav shomer, and the Gemara gives the most perfect example, which is an onion. An onion is concentric rings, one on top of the other, stacked. That's how onions are built. So now let's pick this apart. V'atznan, we have a Mishnah Maseches uktzin. Rabbi Yehuda Omer shalosh klipos bebatzal. There are three different types of layers. Obviously, there's more than three, but there's three brackets of layers of an onion. Penimis, the inner layers are bein shlema bein kedura. Whether they're complete or whether or not there's holes in them, mitzdarefes, they are considered to be an ochel. Emtzais, the middle rung outside of that pnimis, is the shlema is mitzdarefes. The ones that are complete are considered to be a maichel. They're considered to be a food and they're mitzdaref. But kedura, if it's punctured, then ein mitzdarefes. Then the halacha is that it's not considered a food. But look at this, chitzona, the outer layers, bein kachu bein kach tahora. So the Mishnah and Uksin, again, we're learning it on its surface over here. But bein kachu bein kach tahora means that all the outer layers, multiple of them, even though they're shomrim, we don't care what their volume is, even if they're kapul. The halacha is that shomer al gabe shomer is not considered to be mitzdaref. So says the Gemara, when Rav Oshaya asks at the top of this page of Shnei Shomer Ma'u Sheitztarfu, it can't mean that we're talking about a case of Shomer al Gav Shomer. So Rav Oshaya, what was he talking about? No, I agree. I agree that the Mishnah in Uksin is real, and that when it comes to the multiple outermost layers of an onion, that they're not mitzdaref. So what's the case where he's asking about Shnei Shomrim that are mitzdaref? He's talking about Shomer Ochel Shechilku Kami Baile. Let's say that I had a piece of meat covered in hide, and I dissect it. I take a knife and I cut it. So one piece is less than the shiur. It has hide on it with meat on the inside. The other piece has hide on it and meat on the inside. But now they're cut. So now they're less than the shiur when they're separated. So now how do we look at the shomer? Is the shomer mitzdareh from one piece to the next? That was the question of Rabbi Shaya. We'll spend some time learning about attempted answers here. We'll see that we're going to fail to have an answer. We will not answer his question properly, and says the Gemara, let's try and figure it out. Do we say, Kevan dahai lo magen ahai, that the hide on the left piece doesn't cover the right? The hide lo magen ahai, the hide on the right piece doesn't cover the left, therefore lo mitzdarefes, they don't help. Odilma, no, we don't care if the right covers the left or the left covers the right. Odilma, kevan dahai magen adidei, v'hai magen adidei mitzdarfen. Or perhaps what we should say, says the Gemara, is that maybe that each one protects itself, and they're doing their function. The shomer of the right piece is covering the right piece, and the shomer of the left piece is covering the left. The height of each one, they're doing their job. So therefore, they are mitzdaref. So says the Gemara. Let's see if we can answer this question. Yeah, they used to be connected. They're both. Let's say we were talking about a shiur tuma, right? So I have a bone that has flesh and the hide on it. The two bones, each bone with the meat and hide are too small. It's the same as the original case we learned today. Would we say they're mitzdaref? So you reacted like Yehuda. You reacted like Yehuda ben Nekusa did, which is what? Why would these things be mitzdaref? The Tanna Kama actually holds they're mitzdaref. You're just, your brain likes the path of Yehuda ben Nekusa. Wait, these are separate pieces of meat on separate bones. Why even? Okay, so the other Tanaim don't hold that way. They hold that it's a real possibility. Or perhaps that's the chakira that we're looking at right now, is do we say that they could be that's the chakira? So let's see the answer over here. Toshma, we're about 10 lines down on Kufyud Tes Amud Beis. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah mitahir b'shel pool. Umetame b'shel kitnis mipnei sherotze b'mashmishan. As you'll recall, we learned about this, the sheaths, the sharvitin that surround a bean, that if it is b'shel pool, then they're going to be tahor. And if it's mitame b'shel kitnis sherotze b'mashmishan, that will be mitame. So says the Gemara over here, what does that imply? That the only way to get to a shiur is by combining all these small pieces together. So that seems to leave a little bit of an implication that if we're going to have in the later part of this brisa that bishel kitnis, that it's going to be usher, that must be that they're on that we're going to add up all of them separately, because on their own for sure there's no way there's going to be a shiur. It must be that we're mitzdaref then. Says the Gemara, that does not work. No, that's not true. It's not a case of shomer, actually. We're holding on to a stalk that in turn is holding on to all the beans. And that's how they're mitzdarif. Not that they're mitzdarif individually. It's like Stan was saying, they're not mitzdarif individually. But here they're all attached to the same stalk. That's different. That's different. Yeah, that's reasonable. But because they're all connected to the same stalk, so then fine, I got it. But no, two separate entities, of course, they're not going to be mitzdarif. Same as we saw earlier when this case was presented earlier, that there's a convenience of carrying the stalk and in turn the stalk being connected to all the beans. But no, you can't answer really over here that separate entities could be combined. That you can't answer. Toshma, let's try again. What does the pasuk teach us? That when a person brings out seeds and they're going to be planted, so then the Gemara says that has a status of shomer, chita beklipasu, seora beklipasu, adashim beklipasu. And we assume for sure that they have to, if you're going to say that they're going to be mitzdaref, they have to be mitzdaref, because otherwise there's never going to be a shiur of isser. These are tiny little seedlings with their sheaths, with their sharvit, and there's no way that they could ever reach the shiur of pool without being mitzdaref. It must be that they're mitzdaref. Says the Gemara, no. Over here in our case, even though we know we're talking about a case of shomer, maybe we're talking about the spine of, let's say, a piece of wheat that has a lot of kernels on it. And that's why it's mitzvah, similar to the kul chamaro. So says the Gemara, you can't bring a right that things are mitzvah. The Gemara pushes on this answer. Bishlama Elisa, I understand that the upper kernels need the lower one. That I understand. If I have a stalk, let's use it, corn as a great example. Let's say the upper part of the corn, the one that's closer to the tip, away from the okets, those perhaps need the lower ones. But the lower ones don't need the upper ones. Elatatisa, alisa. So says the Gemara, you're right, you're 100% right. Bechadara. We're only talking about one rung, one level. That within one level, we're talking about whether or not they're mitzdaref, and that is what the Gemara wants to suggest when it said that hachanami b'shidro mishum shomer, that the way we're answering up the brisa that says al kol zera zerasher zizareh, and we assume that things are connected. No, we're not assuming that everything is connected, but within one rung of a particular grain, perhaps all of them are mitzdaref to a shiur. Says the Gemara, how could that be? We're talking about the tiniest little seedling. You're telling me we're going to have a massive shiur? Yeah. Says the Gemara, Bechite de Shimon ben Shetach. The chitim of Shimon ben Shetach were huge. Nice. He had a major crop. Every year you see the largest pumpkin contest, the largest zucchini contest. Shimon ben Shetach won the contest. He had grains that were huge, as we'll see in a moment. Says the Gemara, well, now that you've given that answer, you could even have it with one kernel. In other words, Shimon ben Shetach had one kernel, even one kernel of wheat that was the size of a large bean. That's massive. The kernels of wheat are tiny. They're like, I don't know, a couple of millimeters. This was huge. So that's why the Gemara says you can't bring a proof from here. And therefore, we conclude without an answer to Rav Oshai's question. So we'll just chazer without all the details. The question was, Shnei Shomrim Ma'oshe Itztarfu? Do we have two Shomrim, two small Sharvitim, two small little Shomrim that could combine? The answer is we don't know. We don't know. If they're all connected by a stalk, yes. That's that we do know. But if they're completely separate, we don't have an answer to that. We seem to not have precedent in halacha for that. We're right across from Tosfos Ika Damasni, starting at the words Gufa, and we're going to be talking about the original case that we presented on the bottom of Kufir Chesam at Beis a blot ago. The Gemara says Gufa. Let's go back to that case and analyze it. The Gemara says, "Shnei atzamos ve'alein shnei chatzai zesim." If we had two bones, on the right side of the bones there's no flesh. On the left side of the bones, each of the bones has a half zayis. V'yichnis roshein hashniim, and the end that has no meat was placed above, beyond the threshold into my house. Into a person's house, labayis, the bayis ma'ahil alehen, and there's now tumas ohel over the empty side of the bone, though the empty side of the bone is connected. Each of those two bones is connected to the other half of the bone that each have a half zayis. So the Brisa taught us on the bottom of Kuf Yud Chesem and Beis that Abayis tamid that there's tumas ohel, even though the flesh itself is beyond the threshold, but because the empty part of the bone is connected to the full part of the bone, fine. So the Gemara says that there's tuma there, and as mentioned multiple times today already, Yehuda ben Akusa was not having it. He had Stan's train of thinking that Omer Mishum Rabbi Yaakov Heich Shnei Atzamos Mitzdarfen Lekazayis. They're not even connected bones. Why are you doing that? Why would you say that these two things are connected? So Amar Reish Lakish wants to say Lo Shanu Ela Etzem Dehave Yad. We must be talking about a case of bones where they have the status of a yad. Aval Nima, if it were to be a strand of hair that's connected to the meat is outside the threshold, the hair goes into the house, there, lo havya yad. That would not lead to tumas mace. So let's just be clear. The qualification that Rish Lakish is saying is that while it might well be true according to the Tanakama, that an empty bone that's connected to meat, that if the empty bone is in the house, empty half of the bone is in the house, there's tumas mace, tumas oil, maybe, but not if what's going over the threshold is a hair. Fine. Rav Yochanan Amar afilu nima nami havya yad. Even if there's a hair that somehow is connected to a piece of meat, the meat's outside the threshold, the hair is inside the threshold in the house. Could you imagine the tiniest little strand? How thick is a hair? They're so small. The halacha is, according to Rabbi Yochanan, arguing against Reish Lakish, tumas meis, tumas ol. Unbelievable. The Ma'inaf Kamina, a person has very, very long hair. They die right outside the threshold, but their hair goes inside. Reish Lakish would say, nothing to worry about. Rabbi Yochanan would say, the house is tumas meis. An unbelievable nafkamina. Esvei Rav Yochanan the Reish Lakish. Rav Yochanan has a beautiful marimakom that perhaps a hair does carry tuma. It's not what I would have thought. I don't know if I have a balabat shabrain in this regard. I haven't learned these sugyas balamdas. I would have thought that a hair is just not enough to carry over the tuma, not for any good reason. But Rav Yochanan says I have a beautiful marimakom, and therefore I have a kasha and Reish Lakish who says that the tuma only transfers with a bone and that it wouldn't transfer with a hair. Says Rav Yochanan it should transfer even with a hair. Why? Here's what the Brisa says. First of the long line, three-quarters of the way down in Kufi Testament base. Or sheyesh alav kizayis, if you have flesh and there is a kizayis of skin and there's a kizayis of basar on that, hanogeh betziv hayotzi mimenu uveseara shekenegdo, if there's a strand protruding or a hair protruding, tameh. Oh, beautiful. My love, mishum yad kashan Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish, how can you say the tuma only transfers with a bone that goes over the threshold, even a hair that goes over the threshold of that house? Halacha should be the same. Kashan Reish Lakish. Says the Gemara, how does Reish Lakish wriggle out of this? The Gemara says, lo, mishum shomer. No, that's not because of yad. By yad, when we're talking about yad, similar to the stem of an apple, that's not enough if it's a hair. By a shomer, it's enough. That's fine, but not in a case of yad. Says the Gemara, Umi ika shomer al gabe shomer. Says the Gemara, it's not a simple question on its face. Shomer al gabe shomer means a hair that's sticking out of the or that's connected to the flesh. So the hair that's sticking out of the or is shomer al gabe shomer. Remember, we learned at the top of the Yamud that there is no shomer al gabe shomer. We learned about that from the case of the onion, that all the chatzonios layers, even if they were to add up, there is no shomer al gabe shomer. Says the Gemara, chalchule mechalchel. These words are not simple. Chalchule mechalchel means that the hair that we're talking about doesn't emanate from the meat. It pierces through the meat and actually let me say that again. That the hair that we're talking about doesn't emanate from the or from the skin. It actually comes from the flesh itself. So long hair or a strand or a sinew, right? We might be thinking too literally, but there's something that's protruding through the skin, but it originates in the meat. So it's not shomer al gabe shomer. Maskif lo Ravacha bar Yaakov elameata. If that's true, tefillin hechi kasvina. Then we're always going to have a problem. There's things that protrude from skin that are connected to the meat, sinews, whatever they are, hairs that are, whatever the details are. Well, that makes it very difficult to write tefillin. Why? Because every piece of every animal's hide probably has one of these types of scenarios. And haba'inan ksivatama baleka, and we need a parchment, as we've learned previously in Shas. We need parchment that's very complete, that doesn't have pierced holes in it. So says the Gemara, you're right. Ishtimitze hada amre b'ma'arava. I forgot about a little piece of Torah that was taught out in the West, in Eretz Yisrael. Kol nekev shadio over elaveno nekev. If a person were to write on dio, they were to write on parchment, they're writing tefillin, even if there is a tiny little hole, and even if a hair were to protrude from the flesh through the oar, that oar is not puzzle for writing for tefillin, provided that when you write with the ink, that the ink doesn't fall into and pour into that hole. These holes are tiny and they won't fall through a hair. How many microns is there? It's so small. Therefore, not a problem with hilchos tefillin. Another possible answer is kule mishum yad. When we talk about the Mishnah that Rav Yochanan brought on the first of the long lines about the tziv and about the sa'ara, there it really is talking about a yad, and it would be tameh, but kid'amar Rav Ilai b'male'e shebein hamaleim. It's one of many hairs that we are going to talk about, or one of many strands. We'll explain this more in a minute. Hachanami b'nima shebein animin. There's a lot of hairs. So when there are a lot of hairs that are, not just one hair, but when there are a lot of hairs that are hanging over the threshold, then you're right, it would be tameh, and that's what the halacha would be. This answer of Rabbi that we just said, that that when there's one hair among many hairs, it would be problematic. Says the Gemara, aha, we have a brisa from Maseches Uktzin, a Mishnah, I should say, from Maseches Uktzin, when you have a stalk of some type of grain, and at the top it has that beard-looking type of protrusion. You know what I'm talking about? It like at the top of a wheat stalk. It's like when you get to the top of the wheat stalk, they like point outwards, right? So that's what the Gemara is talking about in Uksin. The Gemara says, Malay Shibashibalan mitamen mitamen. They make other things tame and they can become tame. Ve'enan mitzdarfin. Malay lamai chazi. What is the why would they become tameh? Says the Gemara, because they have a function. Amar Ravilai b'malei sheben hamalim, because it's one of many. If I were to pull a piece of grain by one little tiny hair at the top, it would not work. But if I pick it up from the whole bunch, then the whole thing will pick up. Now it has a function. Now it has a function. Good. Says the Gemara, Lishna Achrina Amrila. There's another approach to all of this, which is as follows. 5 lines from the bottom on Kufiyat Testament base. Hachanami Mistabra. It's very reasonable to assume in regards to the Mishnah about the tziv, the Mishnah about the tziv, about the strands, and about the Sarah. Again, that brisa that Rav Yochanan asked about, to Mishum Shomer, that it is talking about a case of Shomer. Why? Tisal Kadaitach Mishum Yad. If you want to say it is talking about Yad, and Nima Achas Lamai Chazi, there is no use for one hair. So therefore, the Gemara says that's not necessarily true, and it's rejecting this Havamina and the Lishna Achrina because we do have a use for this when all the hairs are combined, when all the pieces of the top of the stalk. You're right. Any one of them you will pluck out, but grab all of them, and I have a tfisa of the whole stalk. There is a use of one hair because in combination with all the other hairs, we can actually transfer tuma. And the Gemara repeats its question because it's all part of the Lishna Achrina. So in the Lishna Achrina, there was another version of our Gemara repeating the same dialogue. The Gemara says, what was the Marimakum for Rabbi? That there is this concept of Malay Shebein HaMalayim. The Gemara says, Ahaditnan. It's from the Mishnah that we had in Uksin that we saw a few lines ago. Malay Shebeshibal and Mitamin Matamin Ve'mitzarfin. Malay Lamai Chazi. What are these tiny little hairs on the top of the stalk? What's their function? It's B'Malay Shebein HaMalayim. Okay, so the Gemara says that we do have a function like this. Therefore, the question that Rav Yochanan is asking on Reish Lakish is not a problem. Rav Yochanan was bothered by the fact that Reish Lakish said that a hair has no use. A singular hair may have no use. That's probably true. But if there's a lot of hairs, then you're good to go. Some say that the machlokes between Reish Lakish and Rav Yochanan, the one that we just learned, is actually not where we just saw it. We just saw the machlokes between them right at the open of our Gemara, a third of the way down by Tosfos Ika, in the case of the bones that were brought into the house. That was where they argued. The Gemara says not necessarily. In top of Kufchaf Amid Aleph, Ha'or ve'harota ve'akipa, the open of the perek, mitzdarfen latame tumas ochlin. that these things all join together in order to be metame food. Amar Reish Lakish lo shanu ela etzem da'avi shomer. It's only true by a bone. Aval nima lo havi shomer. So maybe Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan were not arguing on the case that we saw earlier about the bone that's over the threshold. Maybe we're talking about the open of the paraka or v'arotev, that all these things are mitzdaref, and Reish Lakish comes along and says it's only true by etzem. It's not true that etzem is a shomer, but aval nima lo havi shomer. But a hair is not a shomer. Rabbi Yochanan amar afilu nima havi shomer. Same sheet, it's just applying the machlokas Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish to a completely different sugya. So Amar le Reish Lakish or Rabbi Yochanan. Now the script is flipped a little bit, and we're going to learn until the two dots, a third of the way down. So Amar le Reish Lakish to Rabbi Yochanan, mi'ika shomer al gabe shomer. How could you even say that a hair on top of skin is going to be problematic? Don't you know the Mishnah that we learned on the top of the page about the onion, the top of Kufiyat Testament base? Shomer al gabe shomer is a zero. That's not, you're not allowed to do that. So the nima doesn't even count. So how would Rav Yochanan answer that? Like we saw earlier, the hair or the strand is not emanating from the ore, it's emanating from the meat beneath the ore, and therefore there could be tuma according to Rav Yochanan. The Gemara is going to ask all the same questions because we took the machlokas Reish Lakish Rav Yochanan. We thought it was talking about the sugya of Shnei Atzamos. Really, the Gemara says it's talking about our Mishnah or v'harotev. So now we're going to ask all the same questions. So this part of the Gemara should be relatively easy. Maskif lo Rabacha elameyatev. That's true. Tefillin hechi kosvinan. If you're saying that there's a hole in the meat, Rav Yochanan, that's a problem. Then how can you write tefillin? Habayin and ksivatama valeka. Says the Gemara, like we saw earlier, you're right, but ishtamitze ha de amre b'ma'arava. In the West, in Eretz Yisrael, we actually learned the halacha about this, that even if there are small holes in the cloth that I'm writing for tefillin, kol nekev sha'adio over alav, if the hole is small enough and the ink is viscous enough that it won't pour into that hole, then eino nekev, that's not a hole that we're concerned about, so you don't have to worry about ksivatama. We're good with the tefillin. And Eisvei Rav Yochanan the Reish Lakish, like we just saw earlier, or sheyeshalav basar kizayis basar. Let's say we have flesh, and there's a kizayis, a basar that's connected to some skin. Hanogea betziv, if there is a strand protruding, or hayotzi mimenu, hanogea betziv hayotzi mimenu v'sa'ara shekenegdo tame. So we see over here that a strand is problematic. Kasha on Reish Lakish, my lab mishum shomer, and then Reish Lakish is up a creek because Reish Lakish said that that's not a reality. That was how he framed himself out at the top of the page on the second line. That aval nima lo havya shomer. Says the Gemara, lo. We're not dealing with a case of shomer. We're talking about mishum yad, and the halachos are different with a yad than they are with a shomer. Nima achas l'may chazia. What is the value of even one hair? So says the Gemara about a quarter of the way down. Same thing. He says the value of one hair could be that it's when it's among other hairs. Then you can have a transfer of tuma. Where did we see the Marimakum of Rabbi Allah? And this again we've seen 3 times already. In the Mishnah from Uksin. Mitamen. They actually reversed the words here. That's just a mistake in the editor. What's the value of all the hairs all together? When all of them are together, then they actually have a function. So of course this is a very, very complex piece of Gemara. You need to know a lot of background about what is a yad and what is a shomer, and that's very complex, not for the scope of Daf Yomi. But that is the end of our sugya for today. We'll stop right here at the 2 dots, and we'll pick up Amir Hashem on Shabbos. Wishing you all a beautiful night.